I would argue that being emotionally fit is quite similar. You would never go to a gym, choose to do one exercise over and over again. When I hear about people doing one thing over and over to be emotionally fit in their lives, this just doesn't make sense. There are different tools at our disposal, different exercises that exist that are useful for helping us achieve different goals. And I think the sooner we embrace that, the more emotionally fit we're going to become as a society.
It seems to me that there's this unwritten rule that men either aren't allowed to have emotions or aren't allowed to express their emotions. I'm really curious what you think about that.
I think there is that implicit rule that exists in certain cultures. Certainly, some of the circles that I used to hang out in when I was younger, but I don't think it's a great rule for a variety of reasons. One of which is men experience emotions just like women, and we are emotional creatures. And so we are, in a certain sense, fooling ourselves if we tell ourselves we can't experience emotions. I think the real challenge, and my whole book is about this challenge, is how can we find the sweet spot of experiencing emotions in a way that they are functional for us, in a way that they allow us to lead the lives we want to lead and actually work for us. And a big part of that is understanding how to manage them, how to rein them in, how to amplify them. The one of the best counterpoints to this notion that men should never feel emotions is actually a story I start off the book with in chapter 1 about a friend of mine named Matt Mazdam, who he's about as manly as you can get on paper, right? This is a guy who was a champion athlete out of college, and then went into the SEALs, became a Navy SEALs Buds instructor. After that, got his leadership degree at Harvard, and then got tapped to carry the nuclear codes for Obama. So this is the kind of guy who you look at and you expect he's always going to be in control. And what you learn
I
really
would hope
quick,
anyways.
well, it's interesting. Yeah, well, especially when he's got the codes, right? But what you
Right.
what you realize really quickly when you talk to Matt is that he's an emotional creature, just like the rest of us. And he actually talks about the emotions he experiences, both the positive and the negative ones, as tools that help him achieve his goals in life. These are tools that help him be a better soldier, a better leader, a better partner, a better friend. And we've gotten pretty close. And I can tell you, this is an emotional guy. We talk about our frustrations and our victories. And understanding how to do that well, I think, is a source of strength, not weakness. But I'm curious. I'll throw it back to you. Can I throw it back to you for a second, Ryan? Because you started with this question.
Yeah,
What's
absolutely.
how do you feel about this personally as a living, breathing man?
Yeah, well, I agree with you. I think if you would have asked me 8, 9, 10 years ago, I would have said something maybe a little differently. No, I agree. I don't think it's possible to suppress your emotions, to not feel. I don't even think that's humanly possible. When you did say that he's an emotional guy, I felt a little like cringe, like I don't like that. But I think we're conflating two different things: experiencing emotion and reacting emotionally. And I think those are two different things.
Well, I have a whole chapter on this, right? So second chapter of my book, the title is "Can You Really Control Your Emotions?" And I start off by at one point in the chapter, I tell the story of coming across an article that really it kind of shook me initially when I saw the summary, the abstract. You have to keep in mind that I'm the director of a lab called the Emotion and Self-Control Laboratory. So my entire professional life has been devoted to understanding the tools that people can use to manage themselves effectively, to help them lead the lives they want to live. and or lead. And and this study I came across reported that about 40% of the adolescents surveyed in the study, when asked, "Can you control your emotions?" indicated that they did not think you could. So what is going on there? Like, how is that possible? 40% don't think you can control your emotions? That's actually deeply distressing, because if you don't think you can control your emotions, guess what? You're probably not going to try to control your emotions. Here's how
Yeah,
this
it's
makes
futile.
sense. It's futile, right? It's like if you don't think you can lose weight or eat more effectively, you're ever going to take steps. Are you going to join a gym? Are you going to put in the hard work to
No,
do it? No.
I'm gonna eat all the chips and Cheetos and cookies and all the stuff I want to do if I don't think I can actually make a change in my life.
That's exactly right. And so you now see why I was a little bit distressed. But what I break down in this chapter, and it comes directly back to the characterization of Matt as someone who can be triggered but is controlled. So we cannot control the emotions that automatically bubble up in the course of our daily experiences. Like, I cannot control the frustration I might experience or that might be triggered when someone really irritates me, or if I pass someone on the street that smells a certain way or that is attractive, like that is going to elicit certain kinds of emotional reactions
Of
automatically.
course.
Sometimes I do an exercise with folks and I ask them, like when I'm teaching or in a workshop, I want you to anonymously tell me about the darkest thought you experienced over the past week or two. The thoughts that people anonymously report experiencing, they are really dark. They're the kinds of things that people wouldn't
Oh,
admit,
sure.
right? Like, and I sometimes, I will admit, like, I have this dark thought. It comes up pretty often when I'm exercising in the gym, and I tend to do these like group exercise classes, these HIIT classes, and when I'm walking from one side of the gym to the next with an exceptionally heavy dumbbell, just joking, but a dumbbell of reasonable of reasonable
I'm
weight.
sure. No, I'm sure it's exceptional. I'm sure it is.
It is exceptional. I will sometimes like see someone just off to the side of me, like a guy or a girl, like on an exercise mat, and I'll have the thought of what would happen if I dropped this dumbbell on their face.
On their,
Now, on their
I was thinking their
face,
toe. You went to their face.
I go right
Damn.
to the face, like, headshot right there. Like, what's going on? Well, it's probably my brain simulating a worst case scenario. And the moment that thought is triggered, which I'm not proud of and I don't enjoy, guess what I do? I switch hands. I put the dumbbell on the far hand and I squeeze really tight because I don't want to hurt anyone. But these thoughts bubble up all the time. New parents commonly report having thoughts about their kids being injured. This is just a way of how our brains work, right? We're simulating worst case scenarios. I don't have
Mm.
control over that. But what I do have enormous control over, and what Matt has great control over, is once those thoughts and feelings are triggered, how I manage them, whether I amplify them. And sometimes being in control of your emotions doesn't mean suppressing them. It means expressing them. It means revving ourselves up, revving other people up, cueing a kind of emotional response to help us achieve or help that person achieve a particular goal. That is what the art of emotion regulation is all about. Now, sometimes suppressing can be helpful, right? Sometimes if I don't
Sure.
want someone to
There's
see my
appropriate
hand,
times.
there you go. One of my biggest pet peeves in this space, and one of the things that I really hope this book does, is that it dispels people of a giant myth that exists out there, that there are one size fits all solutions when it comes to managing our emotional lives, that guys should just suppress their emotions across the board, or women should just express them, or we should always try to be in the moment, or that avoidance is always toxic, or that self-control has to be hard. These are all myths. We got a lot of tools out there, and the real challenge we face is to learn about what those different tools are and then start experimenting to figure out what are the combinations that work best for us.
I'm having a hard time understanding though, and I don't disagree with what you're saying. I don't not believe what you're saying because I have
Yeah.
those thoughts too. Of I mean, frankly, if we're being honest about the dark thoughts, like murdering people, taking advantage of people, like there's all sorts of dark thoughts everybody has. And if they say they don't think that way, they're lying about it. But I'm having a hard time understanding how that is useful. You say that we're doing it to play out worst case scenarios, but I don't
Sure.
see the connection and the correlation between thinking these dark thoughts and it actually being something of value.
Well, they can be at times. They aren't always. There are some thoughts that bubble up and we don't quite frankly understand why it happens and they have no utility and we move on with our lives and we're all the better for doing so. But there are other kinds of dark thoughts that theoretically, and I think you can make the case, do have some adaptive function. So take my dark thought about the dumbbell dropping on a person's body, right? It's a dark thought about hurting someone. I'm
Sure.
genuinely motivated to not inflict harm on other people. I don't want to do that, right? And so if there's an instance in which I'm having this thought that is now triggering the possibility, what if this were to happen? Like I'm going through that simulation, it doesn't feel good. And the consequence there is I'm taking extra care to not
Mm,
have that occur, right? So
that's fair.
squeezing that dumbbell tighter, I'm taking a longer route away. If my kids are, I remember when my daughter, when my oldest daughter was younger, we were down south and there was this dock that we were messing around on, just playing around, and she had just learned to walk, and I instantly had the thought of her falling into the sea. Right? It's a dark thought. Well, what's the function there? The function is like I made a beeline to make sure she
Sure.
didn't go close to the edge. So that is what I mean, where sometimes these kinds of dark thoughts can have a functionality to them. They need not always, though, have that functionality. But more generally, the idea that we experience intrusive negative thoughts, this is an incredibly common experience that is true of people across cultures.
What I guess the way I would interpret what you said is it's a bit of a red teaming type exercise. Are you familiar with the concept of red teaming?
I'm not. Please tell me.
So with red teaming, it could involve military operations or corporate operations where an organization might come up with a new product or a service, and the red team is supposed to come in and just poke all the holes it possibly can, so that the team can then decide, okay, well that's vulnerable, like that's a situation, that's an issue, like let's fix all these holes before we bring it to market,
That's
or
right.
in military before we actually go on the exercise. And I think that's what I hear you saying in my own words is you're red teaming all of the things that could go wrong so that you could be a more responsible, ethical, righteous human being.
That's right. And sometimes the guardrails on that red teaming process are pretty loose or don't exist. So, this brain of ours, it is remarkably sophisticated in coming up with alternative scenarios for things and coming up with all sorts of possibilities for what could happen. And so sometimes those really outlandish and unrealistic ones sometimes do seep into awareness, and they're so unlikely there is no functionality to them. And so that can happen at times, and we want to be aware of that, because I think it's also important that we don't get down on ourselves if we sometimes do experience a negative thought that we're not proud of, knowing that it is common. We clearly don't want to act on that thought, though.
Yeah, because I think there's some utility in going through that process now that you're explaining it to me. And I also think there's just selfish, in some ways, a lot of vile just desires that are at the expense of other people that obviously I hope it's obvious that we wouldn't act on.
Exactly. Exactly. We don't want to act on those on those dark thoughts. But I bring up this intrusive thought just example just to make the point. There's a difference between the feelings that automatically occur in our lives. I think it is futile to pretend that we can navigate the world without ever experiencing different emotional responses, right?
Mhm.
It's A, not possible, given that emotions are a part of how we work. And B, I would argue it is not desirable because emotions, when they're activated in the right contexts and in the right proportions, can be really, really useful. And I think that's a reframe that we would all do well to embrace. I'll say one more thing, Ryan, just to really punctuate this. So I do a lot of public speaking in my career, and I often like reflect after an engagement, like what really was an A plus and what wasn't. And
Sure.
consistently, when I think back to the engagements that weren't really home runs, they were the times where I didn't experience any anxiety in the days leading up to the engagement. As a result, there was no signal inside me that motivated me to prepare for those engagements, to make sure I was on the top of my game. I just went in there and I winged it. And as a result, it went okay, but not as good as the home runs go. That's an example of how a negative emotional experience like anxiety in the right proportions can be quite effective.
It reminds me of the phrase, how does it go? Hate is not the opposite of love, apathy is. So if you're
Interesting.
completely emotionally detached from the concept of love or expression or feeling for another person, that's antithetical to love. Hate is another emotion. If you truly didn't love the other person or have some feeling towards the other person, you certainly wouldn't hate them. You would just be completely oblivious to that individual.
Yeah, it's like it's not worth your emotional. The stakes aren't there to actually have that response. Hate is certainly triggered in contexts where you care about something, right?
Right.
And it's taking a negative bend that experience as opposed to the more positive love affiliative. But certainly it is a sign that you are invested in
Invested in
some
it.
relationship. Yeah, totally. So,
Yeah.
so go ahead.
Well,
Okay, you had a
you
question.
used a couple of terms interchangeably. So there's some things here. So control, we're talking about emotions now. So control, and I wrote these down: regulate, manage, suppress. Some of these terms got used interchangeably, and I'm wondering if there's a distinction between, for example, controlling versus regulating your emotions, or if it's just semantics.
Three of them are synonyms. One is very distinct. So thank you for pointing this out. So control, manage, regulate. I use those interchangeably. I use those as synonyms. Suppress is a unique tactic that is I would say a method of controlling slash managing slash regulating. And there are lots of
Unhealthy, you would
tactics that exist.
suggest.
Not always.
Okay.
Suppressing is not always unhealthy. Um, if I am in a context where displaying my emotions is going to undermine my goals, then the ability to suppress, I would argue, is useful. Laughing at a funeral, I think, is not a great move, right?
But
There's a
actually,
study.
there are times where it's appropriate. If somebody's giving a
Abs-
thing and they're telling a
sure,
funny anecdote about the deceased, you should laugh.
sure, absolutely. There's nuance to this, right? But
Right.
you're not going to be walking into the facilities, with a big smile on your face, in
Sure,
all
of
likelihood,
course.
right? This is not going to serve you too well. There's this wonderful study that I talk about in the book. It's one of my favorites. That what the researchers wanted to know is in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, what were the individual aptitudes or capacities that predicted resilience? And so what the experimenters did is they brought the participants into the laboratory and they had them do this task that involved, on some trials, they were asked to really express their emotional reaction to viewing like a picture that elicited a response, like a gory image, let's say. So on some trials of this experiment, you're supposed to just express the response fully, like I'm doing now, like eyes wide open, you're seeing emotion come out of me, right? And in other trials, you're supposed to do what you're doing to me right now, like poker face, no expression. There we
That's
go.
just
There,
that's
there
just
we go.
the version of RBF for me is this
I,
face. It's like
I
a very
got it.
serious face.
I get you loud and clear. I just moved back a little bit when I saw that face. So here's the cool part of that about this study. Like you're telling people, like gesticulate, like really be expressive, and then really rein it in. And what the scientists are then doing, and they're using this as an index of your ability to flexibly express or suppress an emotional response so that someone else can either see or not see what you're displaying. And then they track these students over time. I think it was over 18 months or maybe 2 years. It was over a long period of time, and they looked to see which are the participants that are doing best in their lives. It's the
Hmm.
it's the participants who are able to both express really well and suppress really well. It's that capacity to do both of those things that is predicting success. If I'm in an important meeting and it's in a negotiation, right? And I'm really frustrated, sometimes I do want you to see my frustration. Sometimes I want to keep that frustration hidden, right? Depending on what my goals are in the part of that negotiation. And that's true across life. We have evolved the capacity to suppress things for a reason. It's useful in some contexts, but here is like a mantra I live by, and I really hope to impress upon people who are listening and anyone who reads my book, which is there are no one size fits all solutions to managing our emotional lives. We have different tactics at our disposal for a reason. We also know that we human beings, we love to make things super, super simple. We like to put things and people in boxes. Men, they don't feel. Men, they always suppress. Women always express. This isn't how we work. We're like carpenters showing up to a work site. Like my grandfather was a carpenter. He had an amazing tool belt with like all of these different tools that he whipped out depending on the demands of the job. He didn't just show up with a hammer. That would have been insane. Same is true when it comes to our emotional lives.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by this because anybody who listens to this podcast know I hate the term vulnerability. I hate it. I despise it. I think it's not useful. And I think in many cases, it's actually dangerous because people have embraced it as we're just supposed to reveal all in any situation to anybody. And I think that could actually be really dangerous.
Well,
There's parts of our lives where we're not supposed to reveal, and there's parts of our lives to certain and appropriate people that we are supposed to reveal. But this word of vulnerability has become a catch-all for just blab and barf all your feelings all over everybody. And I'm not interested in that.
well, I love your honesty and authenticity there. And dare I even call it vulnerability, Ryan? I'm just joking.
Yeah. Don't call it that.
Yeah.
It's just honesty, honesty or
yeah,
humility,
honesty,
whatever you want to call it.
But I mean, what you're articulating, the frustration you are articulating is the same frustration that I experience when I hear people say, you should always be in the moment.
Mm.
You should never avoid anything. You should always approach. Our lives are incredibly nuanced and complex. When do we ever use one decision rule for every single thing in our lives? We never do, right? And why? So if that's true, why would we want to be so rigid when it comes to our emotional lives? We shouldn't, and I would argue most of us are not. And so like, of course, like, do we want to be open and about every single thing happening inside here in our hearts and minds? No, of course not. It wouldn't be beneficial for any of us. There's a time and a place to do this. Like there's maybe this will resonate with you. I find this to be a really powerful metaphor here. So I'm sizing you up a little bit. I can't quite see your whole full body, but I'm guessing you exercise and work out. Yes,
I do. Yeah.
you do. Okay, so why don't you tell me? Just humor me for a second. What's your routine when you go to the gym?
I do strength training. So I go 6 days a week. I have 3 upper body days, 2 to 3 upper body days, 2 to 3 lower body days, and then 1 or 2 full body days. So that
And
takes me about an hour.
and
And
go
then
more
after that, I
granular.
do,
Go more granular. Like on an upper body day, what do you do?
yeah. So I'll do bench press, overhead press, curls, reverse curls, cable curls, probably mix in some abs,
Okay, that's enough.
incline press,
Good,
etc.
good, good. And you have a goal, which is to be fit, physically fit, and maybe you want your
Strong, fit and strong.
fit and strong. Maybe you want your body to look a certain way. Maybe that's secondary. Doesn't matter. You got goals, and you have a routine, a fairly sophisticated routine to achieve those goals. I would argue that being emotionally fit is quite similar. You would never go to a gym and choose to do one exercise over and over again, right? To meet your goals,
No, of course. Yeah.
right? Like, if you look like Popeye, if all you did is like biceps, like all the time,
Yeah.
it would be ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous to even suggest this to someone. When I hear about people doing one thing over and over to be emotionally fit in their lives, I experience that same level of this just doesn't make sense. There are different tools at our disposal, different exercises that exist that are useful for helping us achieve different goals. And I think the sooner we embrace that, the more emotionally fit we're going to become as a society.
What is the go-to? Like, what is it that most people are like, hey, this is the one exercise I'm going to do, and that's the catch-all.
Well,
That's the everything I need to do.
right now, I think being in the moment, being in the now, and meditating is a big one. And I want to be super clear. I'm a pro being in the moment, pro meditation guy. Against my best wishes, when I was 5 years old, my dad took me to get a mantra to teach me how to meditate, and I've been meditating on and
Your
off throughout
dad
my
did
life.
that?
My dad did that. He was
Super
consumed with
interesting. Do
transcendental meditation.
so do you mind if I ask how old you are?
Oh, well, how old do you think I am?
Oh, see, like this is the game. Not
I'm joking. I'm joking. I'm joking. I know your buttons, Ryan. 45,
so your dad's what, 65, 70 years old?
65. No. He's 75.
70. Okay, so a little bit older on when he started having kids, it sounds like. But
Yeah.
for a 75-year-old man to be interested in that seems a little uncommon.
Oh, it was incredibly uncommon. So, when my dad was, he was he was like a walking contradiction. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, not current Brooklyn, New York, which is this very, hip, super cool place. More like,
Yeah.
um, you know,
I
watch
can
your
hear the New
back.
York in your voice too.
Yeah, it comes out every now and again with the emotions and, fighting and being mugged. You had to be on guard all the time. And my dad was, taught me how to box and defend myself and grew up in that culture of honor in tough guy Brooklyn, but also loved reading about Eastern philosophy and got consumed with meditation. And so there were those two sides of to him. And he would talk to me about this stuff from the time I was a little kid. Terribly, it was painful when he would talk to me about this when I was 5 years old. But as I often tell parents, like, if you think things are important, and your kids are rolling their eyes as you talk to them about it, just keep talking about it because it does get up there. It
Yeah.
took me to get a mantra when I was 5. I wanted a bike, and I didn't get one. I got a mantra, but it is something that has served me well. It's something I believe in. I think there's great data to support the value of meditation. And sometimes when we find ourselves in a thought spiral about the past or the future, bringing our awareness back to the moment, this can be really useful. But it's your front squat. It is your bench press. It is going to help you in some contexts achieve certain goals. but you don't want to do this across the board. Like the ability to think not about about the present, but the future and past. This is a source of resilience for people. It's a way of being successful. Thinking about the future allows me to plan. It allows me to prepare. It also allows me to bathe myself in positivity. Like I got a couple of really hard weeks coming up. You know what I'm thinking about? I'm thinking about where we're going on vacation on spring break a couple of months from now. I'm already drinking that pina colada in my mind. That's mental time travel into the future. I can also go back in time. I'm dealing with adversity at a given moment in time. I experience my fair share like anyone else, right? It's not just about focusing on my breath right now. It's also thinking about my my grandparents who evaded the Nazis and survived, right? If they could get through this, guess what? I could deal with what I'm experiencing. So my ability to travel in time in my mind, this is a superpower. And being in the moment is just one part of it.
I think it's powerful. I was writing down as you were saying that the idea of visualization, for example, is projecting yourself out into a future date, or even just reflection or legacy. You know, you talk about your grandparents. It's like, okay,
Yeah,
well, how do I honor my grandparents by living a good life today based on the sacrifices that they had to endure?
that's right.
Why
That
wouldn't
is
you
right.
tap into that?
We evolved to travel in time in our minds. Like there are species that likely can't do that. They
Well, it's
have many.
consciousness, right?
Yeah,
Like other species
there,
aren't conscious.
there you go. There you go. The other species that are not, they're navigating the world in a what we'd call stimulus response manner. Safety, danger, food, no food, right? Like that's how they are
Intuition
operating.
only.
That's not how we operate. We have this beautiful brain that lets us do all these gymnastics and lets us do remarkable things. You don't want to shut that down entirely. Sometimes we do want to get a break from just getting lost in thought. Of course, we want to be in the moment and we want to lose ourselves. But there are other times where we want to be nimble and going into the past and the future. So what are the things that annoy me? It's it's whenever we say, "What's the one thing you should do?" Because there are no one things. I'll link this back to some data. We did these studies during COVID. We wanted to know, like, what are the tools or tool that is helping people the most when it comes to their daily anxiety? First thing we found is, in general, on a day-to-day basis, people don't do one thing. It's much more similar to like you going to the gym. They do between 3 and 4 different things to manage their anxiety. And the other thing we learned is that there are multiple routes to being successful when it comes to emotion regulation, just as there are multiple routes to being successful when it comes to physical fitness. The 3 or 4 things that person A did on day one and was successful in helping them deal with their anxiety were really different from the things that person B did. The way I regulate my emotions is very, very different from the way my best friend and my wife regulate their emotions. That sounded bad because it just made it feel like my wife is not my best friend. That is not what I meant to say. She's one of my best friends, but you get the point. I'm making a joke there, right? Like
I
so,
mean, the roles are different. Like you can
yeah,
have, I don't think your wife should be your best. Again, it's kind of nuanced a little bit, but you should have a best friend who's a male friend, and you should have a
right,
wife who's also a best friend. Like I get what you're
right,
saying.
yeah. But the point here is that it's a tool belt, lots of different tools. Let's not limit ourselves to just one.
I want to get into some of those tools, but I did have a question about the way that we, as men, generally express our emotions versus our female counterparts. I would imagine that the way that men generally express our emotions is probably more through raising our voice, being violent, trying to be intimidating, et cetera, et cetera. And women are probably a little bit more when they're expressing those emotions or feeling upset about something, probably a little bit more conniving, a little more calculated, a little bit more going around back, like gossiping, that sort of thing. Am I off base on those assessments?
A little bit, like so.
Okay.
Some of the stereotypes that exist have been shown to be to not be upheld. I'll give you an example. There's this
Okay.
very strong notion that men don't like to talk about their feelings. They keep it all inside. This is really where we started. But there's been research on this which shows that when human beings experience strong emotions, they are very motivated to express those emotions to others. And there's reasons for that. It's because we've got these two kinds of needs. We've got social needs. We want to feel connected to those around us. We're stronger when we're connected with others. Our chances of survival are stronger when we're connected with others. And then number two, we've got these cognitive needs, these needs to help us work through our experiences. There are norms that are out there, and I think where we started today taps into some of these norms, these sometimes unspoken rules about how we should operate, right? So men shouldn't reveal vulnerability, and it's okay for women to reveal vulnerability. But sometimes those norms don't actually track with how we are actually built. And in the context of expression, like that seems to be the case. I can tell you that I have a lot of close friends, some who on the surface would come across as very masculine, who do express their emotions. Not across the board in the way that I think you were describing earlier that you find to be a little bit distressing or uncomfortable, but they're strategic. Hey, can I talk to you about something? And we have a conversation about it. And they're stronger, and our relationship is stronger for it. And I think you see that happening actually in friend groups of both genders.
I think I was mostly talking though about the, for lack of a better term, the toxic expression of emotion. So not a healthy way, which is a friend coming, because I've done that too, where I've
Right.
had situations in the past couple of weeks. I've called a couple of buddies, in fact, and said, "Hey, I'm dealing with this right now. You got a minute?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a healthy expression. But I think an unhealthy expression, you tell me if I'm wrong, is really not an attempt to fulfill our need to express our emotions, but to meet our need, whatever that need might be. And so if it's toxic, we will manipulate, and men will manipulate through strength and aggression. Women will manipulate using conniving and backstabbing. Again, I'm just using general. I could be way off,
Right.
but that's what I see generally.
I'll strip away some of the. So there is some evidence that that men will be more externalizing and act out more, and women will co-ruminate more, like about
You
things
said
with
it
one
more
another.
eloquently than I could.
Get lost in, yeah, no, because I know what you're. I think I know what you're saying. I'm just stripping away some of the other language, but so there are some gender differences there in terms of some of those behaviors, and the way I describe it is, there are some traps that we all fall into when it comes to managing our emotional lives, and opportunities to get better. And it's not the case that any one gender suffers more from those traps than others per se. They're just different ones that we want to be aware of.
What would you say are the traps that men fall into then?
I think men are, to your characterization, a little bit more likely to externalize things. And by externalizing, we're talking about like getting it out with frustration in a more aggressive way than.
Well, I mean, something as simple as, I imagine that most of the holes in people's houses are a direct result of a man putting his fist or elbow through the wall relative to the female counterpart. I mean, it's just the reality.
That like externalizing would be a way of being more outwardly aggressive in that manner.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So the biggest trap then you're saying is, we as men need to be cautious of how we externalize our anger or frustration or resentment or any of these things that you would generally consider, and I'm using quotations deliberately, I don't believe this, but this is what people think, negative emotions.
Yes, I think what we want to do is I think men, we want to think about, and this is men, people, we need to think about when are our emotions undermining the goals that we have. So, like if you think about what is the definition of self-regulation? It is our ability to align our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with our goals. Now, I'm
Mm.
hopeful that people listening have healthy goals. They want to be well adjusted in good relationships, live high quality lives that are filled with, you know, flourishing friendships, and they're full of health and they're succeeding at work and life. And letting your emotions run wild, research shows, undermines your ability to achieve those kinds of outcomes. And so if your goal is to be more constrained when you might have the desire to lash out, then we've got to give you tools to help you meet that goal. That's what this is all about.
Say that for me one more time. Say so. Emotional regulation is what? Define that for me again.
It's about aligning our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors with our goals.
Mm.
Right. So sometimes, so let me just like, so we often think about emotion regulation as just clamping down, minimizing the intensity and duration of a response. Sometimes it can be about maximizing it. Right. So sometimes you want to get revved up before a big event, or if you've had some victory, you want to savor that. So in that context, being effective at emotion regulation is about staying in that state. In other cases, emotion regulation is doing the opposite, minimizing intensity, minimizing, shortening duration. So it's about goals. It's about linking this to goals. Goals are an essential piece to this puzzle of how to be good at emotion regulation. Because without the goals, then what are we talking about? We're talking about just finding ways to not feel anything any of the time. That doesn't make much sense.
Yeah, this is interesting because I spend time studying other people, whether it's public speakers or influencers, which I don't necessarily like that term, but everybody understands what it is. Like,
Hmm.
and I see, somebody who gets on stage to speak in front of an audience of 10,000, you can't say that that person is non-expressive of their emotions. They actually know very well how to use their emotion, whether it's pauses, inflections in their voice, maybe even tears, maybe yelling, maybe bringing their voice, the volume down in order to elicit a certain response. In other words, to manipulate. And I know that has a negative connotation. That's not what I'm saying. But maybe the better word is to influence other people.
That's right. We are managing ourselves, but we're also managing other people's emotions too, right? So there are some moments in a presentation where I may want to make people laugh and feel happy, and
Hmm.
there are other times where I may want them to recognize that there's some toughness in the world, and I may want to have them feel a little bit sadder. Sometimes, if I want to get a group to get some practice dealing with like using different regulatory tools, I may cue them to experience a little bit of anxiety, right? Like as a test case so they could play with it. So yeah, we're constantly in thinking about our own emotions, but other people's emotions too. I'll give you just an example. I was just talking about with someone else that most people probably don't even think about. Um, I spend some time in my book talking about sensory experiences as this tool for pushing around our emotions and other people's really easily. Like, think about any airport, international airport you go to, the duty free shops, like, there's a ton of perfume and cologne in there. Like, what is that doing? Who are you wearing that for? This is a tool that you can use to impact how other people feel about you when they just walk past you. Companies do this. Hotels will pipe scents through their ventilation to get you to feel positive. I went to a big concert a couple of months ago. There was one person on the stage with an emotion regulation tool, a guitar, that was powerfully manipulating tens of thousands, influencing, to use your word, softer. A concert. This is like an emotion regulation experience, right? Like, why do we go there? So to your point, yeah, all the time we're impacting other people's emotions, up or down, left and right.
It is interesting because I think there's a lot of men who would say, well, I don't care about what other people think. But I'm looking at the distinction between you and me. You shaved your face today. I did not. You have books behind you for a reason. I have this lighting behind me for a reason. I'm wearing a dark t-shirt for a reason. You're wearing a nice casual blazer with a t-shirt under for a reason. But people
You
don't
got it.
often
You
take that
got
into
it.
consideration.
You got it. Although I'll point out, I did not shave just for
Okay,
you,
well, fair
Ryan,
enough. Fair
for
enough.
a reason, for a reason. No, I say this all the time. This is, of course, this is about, I think it's easy to say we don't care about what anyone else thinks. This is not true. We are implicitly taking into account what other people think about us and managing their impressions every day from the moment we decide whether to shave or not and how to dress and how to organize our spaces. There are some people for whom we care more about that than others, but we are a social species. And I think it's easy to also, I think there's this like, well, if you care what other people think, you're weak because you don't have
Right.
self-confidence, right? Like, I don't think that's actually true. I think that's
It's
about
the right. It's a
being
matter of the right people.
it's about being wise in how you skillfully navigate the world, right? You want to navigate this world to be successful, however you define that. And other people, you're going to encounter them as you navigate this world. So you got to take into account how they're going to react towards you because they often have some implications for whether you're going to be successful or not in your goals.
Well, and I actually think it's maybe more foundational than that. You actually care about them.
In many, many contexts, you do. Absolutely.
Right? Like I think, for example, I actually really care what my kids think about me because I care about them. I care about what my girlfriend thinks of me because I care about her. I care about what the people listening to this podcast think about me because I care about them. Like I do care about them so much so that I'm willing to be intentional about how I put myself in front of them to serve them at maximum capacity.
Nothing to add. I completely agree.
When do you think, though, that because we talked a little bit about regulating your own emotions and we also talked about being aware of other people's emotions, when do you think, though, that it becomes a problem? Is there a line in the sand where it's a problem that you're worried about what other people's emotions or experiences are?
So, yes, you can be over-regulated, over-controlled. And, if you find, for example, that your attempts to regulate your emotions are getting in the way of you living the life you want to live, like that's a clear
Mm.
sign, right? That you're not being effective. You're being overly regulated to the point where you feel suffocated or constrained, or you're not healthy, or you don't have great relationships because you are so over controlling of yourself and maybe other people too. So there's a sweet spot here. And sometimes, let me go back one step. There's this idea that we as human beings are constantly trying to conserve resources, right? We're trying to expend the minimal amount of brain resources, of physiological resources at any given moment in time, because that's just efficient. It makes sense. Regulating often requires resources. It consumes it. So it is not always,
Mm.
but often effortful. So to be regulating all the time is likely to be pretty demanding and
It's exhausting.
exhausting. You got it. We said it at the same time. It's exhausting. I had a friend who was really dealing with some hardship recently, and I was trying to help him through it, and it has been going well. But what I've often heard him say is, "Man, this it's just I'm so tired. I'm just exhausted, constantly trying to reframe and divert my attention and do X, Y, and Z. I'm just tired. So we don't want to be regulating all the time. We want to get back to that point of living our life, of taking things as it comes and trying to achieve, not achieve, I don't know what achieve means, but achieve those flow-like states where we just feel like time is passing, we're immersed, we're, like that can feel really great, being in the moment. But we want the ability when that red button in our brain is pressed that says, hey, you need to regulate in one direction or another. We want to know what to do when that happens. And that's where science provides us with some tips.
What do you do when you feel yourself to that point? Maybe you're overregulating yourself and you're not being as expressive. Like you're not sharing your needs and desires with other people because I don't know, maybe you think you're a burden. I think that's probably what a lot of guys might think. But also you're so worried about, is this person comfortable? Are they okay? Like, are they feeling out of sorts? How does a man begin to, like, what tactics can he employ? This is something that I've heard a lot with nice guys, like the term nice guys, where they're so concerned about manipulating their own behavior at the expense of their self in order to appease other people. What does a guy like that do so that he no longer is as concerned with regulating other people as he should be? Because I just think, like you said, that's exhausting.
So just to make sure I get the question. So what does someone do when they find themselves just totally depleted because they're over regulating?
Overregulating themselves and worrying about other people. So even
Yeah, well, I
regulating
think
other people's emotions.
I think that's a great, there are tools for regulation that you can use on your own. There are people tools, our relationships with other people. Other people can be helpful. They can help regulate ourselves, right? Conversations. And then there are environmental tools. For me, when it gets to the point where I'm not sure if I'm regulating effectively or maybe too much, that's usually my cue to tap into the network, tap into that trusted network of advisors who are just really invaluable for helping me put things in perspective, for helping me recalibrate, for calling me out when maybe I'm doing wacky things. I remember a couple of weeks ago, I was concerned about something. I articulated it to a friend, and he's like, "Nope, that's magical thinking. No way. Adios." And that was like just oh, that's right, and it put me back on track. So
Because
for
you
me,
expressed it is what you're saying. You vocalized it and then you
oh
heard
yeah,
it and you're like, okay, that's crazy. Like I'm
that's
out.
right, that's right,
Got it.
that's right.
Okay.
And so for me, that other people are like a layer two intervention for me. Like when I'm not sure how I'm operating myself, I think so when I pick up the phone and I've got a great, I call them my board of advisors. Like I got a great board of trusted friends, loved ones, colleagues who can help when that uncertainty arises.
You talked about environmental regulators, things that you can do with your environment. What would you
Yeah,
suggest there?
couple of things. Creating order. So cleaning up, organizing. It's interesting always to me because I tend not to be a very organized guy in my physical space, but we know that when you're not experiencing order in your minds because your emotions are taking over, creating order around you compensates. It's called compensatory control. So order around you to provide some order up here. Easy thing to do. Enhancing your exposure to green spaces, going for a walk in a safe, natural setting is cognitively restorative. Lots of research highlight this. That was really eye-opening for this city boy, but I've, implemented that.
Mm.
Thinking about the places that you are positively attached to. We talk about getting attached to people, loved ones in our lives, friends, and how those relationships can be a source of resilience. Well, we also get attached to places. And when we are in places that we are securely attached to, being in those physical spaces can provide a sense of security and control. I remember when my kids were little, whenever they felt sick or something bad happened at school, they would say, I just want to go into my room at home because that was a place that was secure for them.
Mm.
there are places all around us that we have those positive attachments to, and those can be like seeking out those spaces can also be a source of resilience. The flip side is also true, of course. There are places we are negatively attached to, and you want to
Good
avoid
point.
those as well.
And people, right?
And people, absolutely.
You know, as funny as you were talking about your kids being sick, I wasn't taken to a place. I was actually taken to a food item, you know, where your mom makes you soup.
Yeah.
Like soup isn't a cure for the cold or the flu, but for some reason it just feels better.
Well, and so this is a kind of, I call that in the book a sensory shifter. And there are a couple of ways that that can help. Number one, there are some, if it is not putrid tasting or smelling, if it tastes good, there's some positivity that comes from that. But our senses are also linked with our memories. And so if you have
Mm,
positive associations with certain sensory experiences like soup and your loving mom, let's say, like that, those memories become activated in ways that can also help promote positive emotional states.
yeah. Man, this stuff's so interesting to me because I think it's most interesting because, like I said, 8, 9 years ago, I would have said it differently. I think I'm a little more tempered in my approach. And I like what you're coming from is that we're not just going to blab all of our stuff to everybody. That's ridiculous. It's counterintuitive, it's counterproductive, and it's just not a good idea. But I like this moderate approach of, hey, feel your emotions, express them when appropriate or how appropriate, and then use them as tools to improve your life. How do negative emotion, like again, do you believe in negative emotions? Let me ask you that. Are there such a thing as negative emotions?
Um, yes, there are, and let
Okay.
me let me let me let me define it for you. But I'll also say you just perfectly summarized, I think, what what this book is all about, and those points are true for men and for women. This is all about trying to be flexible with how we manage the curveballs that life deals us. We all get them. And it's about finding the right tools to manage those curveballs. Um, Negative emotions. Do I think, and there are such negative emotions? I think there are negative emotions in the sense that certain kinds of emotional experiences don't feel good. They feel bad. Um, I think anxiety feels bad. I think sadness feels bad. I think anger usually doesn't feel great. So in that sense, I think they're negative, but negative doesn't mean harmful or bad for you per se.
Mm,
Negative emotions in the right proportions are are just fine. It is when they are experienced too intensely or too long that they become harmful. So negative is not the same as harmful. I'll give you another way of making sense of that. Like, have you ever benefited from critical negative feedback on yourself, your work,
of
something you've
of
done?
course.
Of
Yeah,
course,
absolutely.
it's negative by definition, right? Like you did not do something well, but it is useful because you can learn from that. So negative doesn't mean bad. That's what the point here is.
Yeah. I'm glad you clarified because I think in concept we agree. The language maybe is a little different because I would say there's no such thing as a negative emotion. For
Yeah.
example, anger is not a you might feel bad to your point, but I don't think it's a
Yeah.
negative thing. I think we're saying the same thing. We're just saying it differently.
Yeah, which I think is, earlier in the interview too, I think it was similar there where oftentimes I think the underlying meaning that you and I are exchanging in this interview is there, and sometimes the words are just different.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's why these conversations are so powerful. If I were to put, for example, there's no such thing as a negative emotion on a Twitter, like a tweet, for example, you might come in and say, well, that's not true.
Yes, yes.
But the reality is we have a conversation like this. We might absolutely agree. We're just using different words.
And it's funny you say that because I did put a post to that effect in the past, and someone did say that actually isn't true. And then when they elaborated, it was very clear that actually we're saying the same things. And so I think that
Yeah.
gets to a broader point, and what I appreciate about you as an interviewer is that there's this willingness to really understand what the underlying meaning here is, rather than just get caught up in the words, which for various reasons aren't often eye to eye.
Yeah, I think a lot more people are probably closer in spiritual beliefs and political alignment than we would think, because we're just using different words and we're doing it in 140 characters at a time.
Yeah, and if we, and this gets to a slightly different, though similarly emotional topic. If we don't try to find that common ground and those points of intersection, and we just, I think there's a temptation that when we don't use the same words, we just stop talking to each other. I think that's what really gets us into trouble.
It is interesting because I've thought about this, and we could get a little deep, and we won't necessarily in this conversation, but words are just sounds. Like it's just noises we're making. And it's interesting to me that we can become so emotionally charged through the noises that mammals are making because of the meaning and the intent and everything else that we put behind it. So it's a very interesting thing to me.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's wild when you think about it in
Yeah.
those ways, for sure. And I think just the reminder, and hopefully this conversation can be a reminder to folks, is to always try to dig a little bit deeper to understand the meaning, as you and I have both done in this interview.
Ethan, how do we connect with you? Obviously, the book is coming out. It's called Shift, Managing Your Emotions So They Don't Manage You. How do we connect with you, pick up a copy of the book, and anything else you might want to share?
The easiest way to connect with me is to check out my website, www.ethankross with a Kross.com. And there's information about me and my book. And I hope you find it interesting and
I
useful.
appreciate you joining me. Yeah, no, I know guys will if they read the book, and most importantly, they apply it. And this is an area that I think not only men who listen, but myself as well, could really work on improving. So really appreciate your insight, really appreciate your work, and anxious to get this out to the guys. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.